Mandate of heaven explaining the right of rebellion in political philosophy. The right of revolution or right of rebellion is the right or duty of a people to overthrow the government that acts against their common interests and/or threatens the safety of the people without cause. Stated throughout history in one form or another, the belief in this right has been used to justify various revolutions, including the American Revolution, French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Iranian Revolution. One example of the emergence of a right of revolution can be traced back to Honor the Law Speaker, who in 1018 had a dramatic confrontation with the King of Sweden. The law speaker claimed the King of Sweden was accountable to the people and would be overthrown by them if he continued with his unpopular war with Norway. Another example is Magna Carta, an English charter issued in 1215, which required the king to renounce certain rights and accept that his will could be bound by the law. It included a security clause that gave the right to a committee of barons to overrule the will of the king through force if needed. Magna Carta directly influenced the development of parliamentary democracy and many constitutional documents, such as the United States Constitution. The Golden Bull of 1222 was a Golden Bull, or edict, issued by King Andrew I of Hungary. The law established the rights of Hungary's noblemen, including the right to disobey the king when he acted contrary to law jus resistendi. The Golden Bull is often compared to Magna Carta. The bull was the first constitutional document of the nation of Hungary, while Magna Carta was the first constitutional charter of the nation of England. Divine Right of Kings. Henry VII declared himself supreme head of the Church of England and ushered in the doctrine of Divine Right of Kings. Monarchy. The Divine Right of Kings. Divine right, or God's mandate, is a political and religious doctrine of political legitimacy of a monarchy. It stems from a specific metaphysical framework in which a monarch is, before birth, preordained to inherit the crown. According to this theory of political legitimacy, the subjects of the crown have actively and not merely passively turned over the metaphysical selection of the king's soul, which will inhabit a body and rule them, to God. In this way, the divine right originates as a metaphysical act of humility and/or submission towards God. Divine right has been a key element of the legitimation of many absolute monarchies. Significantly, the doctrine asserts that a monarch is not accountable to any earthly authority such as a parliament because their right to rule is derived from divine authority. Thus, the monarch is not subject to the will of the people, of the aristocracy, or of any other estate of the realm. It follows that only divine authority can judge a monarch, and that any attempt to depose, dethrone or restrict their powers runs contrary to God's will and may constitute a sacrilegious act. It is often expressed in the phrase "by the grace of God," which has historically been attached to the titles of certain reigning monarchs. Note, however, that such accountability only to God does not per southeast make the monarch the sacred king. Historically, many notions of rights have been authoritarian and hierarchical, with different people granted different rights and some having more rights than others. For instance, the right of a father to receive respect from his son did not indicate the right for the son to receive a return from that respect. Analogously, the divine right of kings, which permitted absolute power over subjects, provided few rights for the subjects themselves. In contrast, conceptions of rights developed during the Age of Enlightenment, for example during the American and French Revolutions, often emphasized liberty and equality as being among the most important of rights. Thomas Aquinas also writes about the right to resist tyranny in the Summa Theologica. He considers a law not to be a law at all, but an act of violence, if it contradicts either human or divine good, overextends the power of the lawgiver, or hampers different parts of society unequally. 8 For Aquinas, overthrowing a tyrant does not make the population seditious. Rather, the tyranny of tyrants means they commit sedition, by which Aquinas means disturbance of those who work together lawfully for the good of the multitude. Indeed, it is the tyrant rather that is guilty of sedition, since he encourages discord and sedition among his subjects, that he may lord over them more securely, for this is tyranny, since it is ordered to the private good of the ruler and to the injury of the multitude. 9 Nicole Ortham, in his Livre de Politiques, categorically denied any right of resistance. John of Salisbury advocated direct revolutionary assassination of unethical tyrannical rulers in his Polycraticus. Columbus and the crew of his ship were the first Europeans to encounter the Taino people, as they landed in the Bahamas on October 12, 1492. After their first interactions, Columbus described the Taínos as a physically tall, well-proportioned people, with a noble and kind personality. In his diary, Columbus wrote, "They traded with us and gave us everything they had. With goodwill they took great delight in pleasing us. They are very gentle and without knowledge of what is evil, nor do they murder or steal. Your Highness may believe that in all the world there can be no better people. They love their neighbors as themselves, and they have the sweetest talk in the world, and are gentle and always laughing." Evidence suggests that some Taino women and African men intermarried and lived in relatively isolated Maroon communities in the interior of the islands, where they developed into a mixed-race population of peasants who were relatively independent of Spanish authorities. For instance, when the colony of Jamaica was under the rule of Spain, known then as the colony of Santiago, both Taino men and women fled to the Bastadas Mountains, currently known as the Blue Mountains. There the escaped African slaves intermingled with the Taino. They were among the ancestors of the Jamaican Maroons of the East, including those communities led by Juan de Boas and Juan de Ceros. The Maroons of Moortown claim descent from the Taino. Jamaica was an English colony from 1655 when it was captured by the English from Spain, and a British colony from 1707 until 1962, when it became independent. Jamaica became a crown colony in 1866. In late 1654, English leader Oliver Cromwell launched the Western Design Armada against Spain's colonies in the Caribbean. In April 1655, General Robert Venables led the Armada in an attack on Spain's fort at Santo Domingo, Hispaniola. However, the Spanish repulsed this poorly executed attack, known as the Siege of Santo Domingo, and the English troops were soon decimated by disease. Weakened by fever and looking for an easy victory following their defeat at Santo Domingo, the English force then sailed for Jamaica, the only Spanish West Indies island that did not have new defensive works. Spanish Jamaica had been a colony of Spain for over 100 years. In May 1655, around 7,000 English soldiers landed near Jamaica's Spanish town capital. The English invasion force soon overwhelmed the small number of Spanish troops at the time. Jamaica's entire population only numbered around 500. In the following years, Spain repeatedly attempted to recapture Jamaica, and in response in 1657 the English governor of Jamaica invited buccaneers to base themselves at Port Royal on Santiago, to help defend against Spanish attacks. Spain never recaptured Jamaica, losing the Battle of Ocorials in 1657 and the Battle of Rio Nuevo in 1658. Governor Edward Oily succeeded in persuading one of the leaders of the Spanish Maroons, Juan de Boas, to switch sides and join the English along with his Maroon warriors. In 1660, when Don Cristobal de Assisi realized that de Boas had joined the English, he admitted that the Spanish no longer had a chance of recapturing the island, since de Boas and his men knew the mountainous interior better than the Spanish and the English. De Assisi gave up on his dreams, and fled to Cuba. For England, Jamaica was to be the dagger pointed at the heart of the Spanish Empire, although in fact it was a possession of little economic value then. Early English colonization. Despite the fact that Jamaica was an English colony, Oliver Cromwell increased the island's white population by sending indentured servants and prisoners captured in battles with the Irish and Scots, as well as some common criminals. This practice was continued under Charles II, and the white population was also augmented by immigrants from the North American mainland and other islands, as well as by the English buccaneers. But tropical diseases kept the number of whites well under 10,000 until about 1740. The white population increased, through migration from Britain, to 80,000 in the 1780s. Although the slave population in the 1670s and 1680s never exceeded roughly 9,500, by the end of the 17th century imports of slaves increased the black population to at least 3 times the number of whites. Beginning with the Stuart monarchy's appointment of a civil governor to Jamaica in 1661, political patterns were established that lasted well into the 20th century. The second governor, Lord Windsor, brought with him in 1662 a proclamation from the king giving Jamaica's non-slave populace the rights of English citizens, including the right to make their own laws. Although he spent only 10 weeks in Jamaica, Lord Windsor laid the foundations of a governing system that would to last for 2 centuries, a crown-appointed governor acting with the advice of a nominated council in the legislature. The legislature consisted of the governor and an elected but highly unrepresentative House of Assembly. England gained formal possession of Jamaica from Spain in 1670 through the Treaty of Madrid. removing the pressing need for constant defense against Spanish attack. This change served as an incentive to planting. For years, however, the planter-dominated Jamaica House of Assembly was in continual conflict with the various governors and the Stuart kings. There were also contentious factions within the Assembly itself. For much of the 1670s and 1680s, Charles II and James II and the Assembly feuded over such matters as the purchase of slaves from ships not run by the Royal English Trading Company. The last Stuart governor, the Duke of Albemarle, who was more interested in treasure hunting than in planting, turned the planter oligarchy out of office. After the Duke's death in 1688, the planters, who had fled Jamaica to London, succeeded in lobbying James II to order a return to the pre-Albemarle political arrangement, and the revolution that brought William II and Mary to the throne in 1689 confirmed the local control of Jamaican planters belonging to the Assembly. This settlement also improved the supply of slaves and resulted in more protection, including military support, for the planters against foreign competition. This was of particular importance during the Anglo-French War in the Caribbean from 1689 to 1713. However, even though the Spaniards no longer threatened Jamaica, the early English settlers had to ward off attacks from the French. In 1694, Jean-Baptiste Ducasse led a force of 3 warships and 29 transport ships that landed at Port Morant in eastern Jamaica, where they burnt plantations, destroyed over 50 sugar works, kidnapped hundreds of slaves, and killed and tortured many white colonists. Ducasse then sailed down the southern coast, eventually landing at Carlisle Bay, with the object of marching on to Spanish Town. However, a militia company of planters and their slaves defeated Ducasse, who then destroyed Carlisle Bay, and withdrew to St. Domingue. Maroons. When the English captured Jamaica in 1655, the Spanish colonists fled, leaving a large number of African slaves. These former Spanish slaves created 3 catalongs, or settlements. Former slaves organized under the leadership of Juan de Cerros allied with the Spanish guerrillas on the western end of the Cockpit country, while those under Juan de Boas established themselves in modern-day Clarendon Parish, Jamaica, and served as a black militia for the English. The third chose to join those who had previously escaped from the Spanish to live and intermarry with the Arawak people. Each group of Jamaican Maroons established distinct communities free black people in Jamaica in the mountainous interior. They survived by subsistence farming and periodic raids of plantations. Over time, the Maroons came to control large areas of the Jamaican interior. In the second half of the 17th century, de Cerros fought regular campaigns against the English forces, even attacking the capital of Spanish Town, and he was never defeated by the English. In the early 18th century, the Maroons took a heavy toll on the British troops. The British colonial authorities sent local militia and British Army units against them, but the Maroons successfully fought a guerrilla campaign against them in the mountainous interior, and forced the British government to seek peace terms to end the extensive conflict. In the early 18th century, English-speaking escape-taken slaves were at the forefront of the Maroon fighting against the British. Cudjoe led the Leeward Maroons in western Jamaica, while Corau and Queen Nanny were the leaders of the Windward Maroons in the Blue Mountains of eastern Jamaica. The rebellion finally ended, however, with the signing of peace agreements in 1739 and 1740. Jamaica's pirate economy. Spanish resistance continued for some years after the English conquest, in some cases with the help of the Jamaican Maroons, but Spain never succeeded in retaking the island. The English established their main coastal town at Port Royal. Under early English rule, Jamaica became a haven of privateers, buccaneers, and occasionally outright pirates, Christopher Miles, Edward Manabelt, and most famously, Henry Morgan. In addition to being unable to retake their land, Spain was no longer able to provide their colonies in the New World with manufactured goods on a regular basis. The progressive irregularity of annual Spanish fleets, combined with an increasing desperation by colonies for manufactured goods, allowed Port Royal to flourish, and by 1659, 200 houses, shops, and warehouses surrounded the fort. Merchants and privateers worked together in what is now referred to as forced trade. Merchants would sponsor trading endeavors with the Spanish while sponsoring privateers to attack Spanish ships and rob Spanish coastal towns. While the merchants most certainly had the upper hand, the privateers were an integral part of the operation. Nuala Zakidi, a lecturer at the University of Edinburgh, wrote, Both opponents and advocates of so-called forced trade declared the town's fortune had the dubious distinction of being founded entirely on the servicing of the privateers' needs and highly lucrative trade in prized commodities. She added, the report that the 300 men who accompanied Henry Morgan to Portobello in 1668 returned to the town with a price to spend of at least £60 each, 2 or 3 times the usual annual plantation wage, leaves little doubt that they were right. The forced trade became almost a way of life in Port Royal. Michael Pawson and David Busser wrote, one way or the other nearly all the propertied inhabitants of Port Royal seemed to have an interest in privateering. Forced trade was rapidly making Port Royal one of the wealthiest communities in the English territories of North America, far surpassing any profit made from the production of sugarcane. He wrote, the Portobello raid in 1668 alone produced plunder worth £75,000, more than 7 times the annual value of the island's sugar exports, which at Port Royal prices did not exceed £10,000 at this time. However, many successful privateers and buccaneers became integrally involved in the growing sugar industry, and its acquisition of large number of African slaves. In the 1670s and 1680s, in his capacity as an owner of a large slave plantation, Morgan led 3 campaigns against the Jamaican Maroons of Wanty-Saros. Morgan achieved some success against the Maroons, who withdrew further into the Blue Mountains, where they were able to stay out of the reach of Morgan and his forces. An illustration of pre-1692 Port Royal English map of Jamaica from the 1670s 26 European colonies in the Caribbean during the 18th century. 1692 earthquake and the collapse of Port Royal. Main article, 1692 Jamaica Earthquake. On June 7, 1692, a violent earthquake struck Port Royal. 2/3 of the town sank into the sea immediately after the main shock. According to Robert Rennie in his An History of Jamaica 1807, all the wharves sunk at once, and in the space of 2 minutes, 9/10 of the city were covered with water, which was raised to such a height, that it entered the uppermost rooms of the few houses which were left standing. The tops of the highest houses were visible in the water, and surrounded by the masts of vessels, which had been sunk along with them. Before the earthquake, the town consisted of 6,500 inhabitants living in about 2,000 buildings, many constructed of brick and with more than 1 story, and all built on loose sand. During the shaking, the sand liquefied and the buildings, along with their occupants, appeared to float into the sea. In the immediate aftermath of the earthquake, it was common to ascribe the destruction to divine retribution on the people of Port Royal for their sinful ways. Members of the Jamaica Council declared, "We are become by this an instance of God Almighty's severe judgment." This view of the disaster was not confined to Jamaica. In Boston, the Reverend Cotton Mather said in a letter to his uncle, "Behold, an accident speaking to all our English America." After the earthquake, the town was partially rebuilt, but the colonial government was relocated to Spanish Town, which had been the capital under Spanish rule. Port Royal was devastated by a fire in 1703 and hurricane in 1722. Most of the sea trade moved to Kingston. By the late 18th century, Port Royal was largely abandoned. 18th century Jamaica's sugar boom. Sugar cane cutters in Jamaica. 1880 sugar cane cutters in Jamaica. 1891 In the mid-17th century, sugar cane had been brought into the British West Indies by the Dutch, from Brazil. Upon landing in Jamaica and other islands, they quickly urged local growers to change their main crops from cotton and tobacco to sugarcane. With depressed prices of cotton and tobacco, due mainly to stiff competition from the North American colonies, the farmers switched, leading to a boom in the Caribbean economies. Sugar was quickly snapped up by the British, who used it in cakes and to sweeten teas. In the 18th century, sugar replaced piracy as Britain's main source of income, and Jamaica became the largest exporter of sugar in the British Empire. Sugar became Britain's largest import in the 18th century. The sugar monoculture and slave work plantation society spread across Jamaica throughout the 18th century. The sugar industry was labor-intensive, and the English brought hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans to Jamaica. In 1673, there were only 57 sugar estates in Jamaica, but by 1739, the number of sugar plantations grew to 430. By 1832, the median-sized plantation in Jamaica had about 150 slaves, and nearly 1 of every 4 bondsmen lived on units that had at least 250 slaves. Simon Taylor sugar planter who owned estates in the Jamaican parishes of St. Thomas and St. Mary, was one of the wealthiest men in the British Empire in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. During the 18th century, those white men who survived tropical diseases were, on average, 50 times wealthier than those who resided in the British Isles. Other British planters who became wealthy as a result of sugar and slavery in Jamaica included Peter Bedford, Francis Price Planter and Charles Ellis, 1st Baron Seaford. Growth of slavery Jamaica's blacks did not increase significantly in number until well into the 18th century, in part because the slave ships coming from the west coast of Africa preferred to first unload at the islands of the Eastern Caribbean. At the beginning of the 18th century, the number of slaves in Jamaica did not exceed 45,000, but this population rose to about 75,000 in 1730, and passed the 100,000 mark in the 1740s. In 1778, the black slave population passed 200,000 and by 1800 it had increased to over 300,000. The oppression of free black and free people of color increased during the early 18th century. In 1724, a white planter named William Broderick insulted Francis Williams, poet who also ran a school for the children of free black people in Jamaica. Broderick called him a black dog, whereupon Williams reacted by calling Broderick a white dog several times. Broderick punched Williams, as a result of which his mouth was bloody, but Williams retaliated, after which Broderick's shirt and neckcloth had been torn sick by the said Williams. Williams insisted that since he was a free black man, he could not be tried for assault, as would have been the case with black slaves who hit the white man, because he was defending himself. The assembly, which comprised elected white planters, was alarmed at the success with which Williams argued his case, and secured the dismissal of Broderick's attempts to prosecute him. Complaining that Williams's behavior is of great encouragement to the Negroes of the island in general, the Assembly then decided to bring in a bill to reduce the said Francis Williams to the state of other free Negroes in this island. This legislation made it illegal for any black person in Jamaica to strike the white person, even in self-defense. After slavery was abolished in the 1830s, sugar plantations used a variety of forms of labor, including workers imported from India under contracts of indenture. First Maroon War. Main article. First Maroon War. Starting in the late 17th century, there were periodic skirmishes between English militias and the Windward Maroons, alongside occasional slave revolts. In 1673 one such revolt in St. Anne's parish of 200 slaves created a separate group of Leeward Maroons. These Maroons united with a group of Madagascans who had survived the shipwreck of a slave ship and formed their own Maroon community in St. George's Parish, modern-day St. Mary and Portland. Several more rebellions strengthened the numbers of this Leeward group. Notably, in 1690 the revolt at Sutton's Plantation, Clarendon of 400 slaves considerably strengthened the Leeward Maroons. In September 1728, the British sent more troops to Jamaica, leading to an intensification of the conflict. However, despite increased numbers, the British colonial authorities were unable to defeat the Windward Maroons. That's when they brought in bush trappers from Africa and recruited them to integrate into the Maroon community as runaway slaves, today's Special Branch Police. The Leeward Maroons inhabited cockpits, capes, or deep ravines that weren't easily defended, even against troops with superior firepower. Such guerrilla warfare and the use of scouts who blew the Abemba horn, which was used as a trumpet to warn of approaching British soldiers, allowed the Maroons to evade, thwart, frustrate, and defeat the forces of an empire. In 1739–40, the British government in Jamaica recognized that it could not defeat the Maroons, so they offered them treaties of peace instead. In 1739, the British, led by Governor Edward Trelawney, sued for peace with the Leeward Maroon leader, Cudjoe, described by British planters as a short, almost dwarf-like man who for years fought skillfully and bravely to maintain his people's independence. Some writers maintain that during the conflict, Cudjoe became increasingly disillusioned, the term used when destroying a person's character, and quarreled with his lieutenants and with other Maroon groups. He felt that the only hope for the future was a peace treaty with the enemy which recognized the independence of the Leeward Maroons. In 1742, Cudjoe had to suppress the rebellion of Leeward Maroons against the treaty. In 1740, the even more rebellious Windward Maroons of the Blue Mountains also agreed to sign the treaty under pressure from both white Jamaicans and the Leeward Maroons. In exchange for securing their freedom, the Maroons were asked to agree not to harbor new runaway slaves, but rather to help catch them. This last clause in the treaty naturally caused a split between the Maroons and the rest of the black population, although from time to time runaways from the plantations still found their way into new Maroon settlements, such as those run by Three-Fingered Jack Jamaica. Another provision of the agreement was that the Maroons would serve to protect the island from invaders. The latter was because the Maroons were revered by the British as skilled warriors. Following the peace treaties of 1739 to 1740, virgin land was opened up to settlement, and Jamaica's economy flourished in the period of peace that followed. 5 official Maroon towns were established in the aftermath of the treaties: Wacompong, Jonestown, Trelawney Town, Nanny Town, later known as Moortown, Scotch Hall, Jamaica, and Charlestown, Jamaica, living under their own rulers and a British supervisor known as a superintendent. Tacky's Revolt main articles, Three-Fingered Jack Jamaica and Tacky's Revolt, the repression of the slaves in Jamaica, was considered by contemporaries to be amongst the most brutal in the world. In 1739, Charles Leslie wrote that, "No country excels Jamaica in a barbarous treatment of slaves, or in the cruel methods they put them to death." Aqua, Queen of Kingston. In the 1750s, during the reign of Queen Aqua, Queen of Kingston, a runaway slave named Ancoma formed a community made up of escaped slaves in what is now known as St. Thomas Parish, Jamaica. In 1759, Ancoma was eventually killed by a Maroon woman and another woman, both his captives. However, his community continued to thrive, and probably formed the basis of the community of Jack Manson later that century. The colony slaves, who outnumbered their white masters by a ratio of 20:1 in 1800, mounted over a dozen major slave conspiracies, the majority of which were organized by Coromantans and uprisings during the 18th century, including Tacky's Revolt in May 1760. In that revolt, Tacky, the slave overseer on the frontier plantation in St. Mary Parish, led a group of enslaved Africans in taking over the Frontier and Trinity plantations while killing their enslavers. They then marched to the storeroom at Fort Haldane, where the munitions to defend the town of Port Maria were kept. After killing the storekeeper, Tacky and his men stole nearly 4 barrels of gunpowder and 40 firearms with shot, before marching on to overrun the plantations at Haywood Hall and Esher. By dawn, hundreds of other slaves had joined Tacky and his followers. At Ballard's Valley, the rebels stopped to rejoice in their success. One slave from Esher decided to slip away and sound the alarm. This traitor to the slaves' cause is never mentioned when inciting hatred between Maroons and other Jamaicans by political offices or news agencies. Opium and Caribbean witch doctors quickly circulated around the camp dispensing a powder that they claimed would protect the men from injury in battle, and loudly proclaimed that an opium man could not be killed. Confidence was high. Soon there were 70 to 80 mounted militia on their way, along with some Maroons from Scotch Hall, who were bound by treaty to suppress such rebellions. When the militia learned of the opium man's boast of not being able to be killed, an opium man was captured, killed and hung with his mask, ornaments of teeth and bone and feather trimmings at a prominent place visible from the encampment of rebels. Many of the rebels, confidence shaken, returned to their plantations. Tacky and 25 or so men decided to fight on. Tacky and his men went running through the woods, being chased by the Maroons and their legendary marksman, Davy the Maroon. While running at full speed, Davy shot Tacky and cut off his head as evidence of his feat, for which he would be richly rewarded. Tacky's head was later displayed on a pole in Spanish Town until a follower took it down in the middle of the night. The rest of Tacky's men were tracked down and found in a cave near Tacky Falls, and murdered. Official report states they committed suicide rather than go back to slavery. Aqua, Queen of Kingston. It was also discovered that Coromantee slaves in Kingston had elected a female fan slave named Cuba. The British misnomer of the fan they named Cuba or Aqua the rank of Queen of Kingston. Cuba Aqua sat in state under a canopy at their meetings, wearing a robe and crown. It is unknown whether there was any direct communication between Cuba's people and Tacky's, but when discovered, she was ordered to be transported from the island for conspiracy to rebel. Whilst at sea, She bribed the captain of the ship to put her ashore in western Jamaica, where she joined the leeward rebels and remained at large for months. On being recaptured, she was executed. Queen, the Queen of Kingston in Jamaica or Cuba Cornwallis, as she is popularly known, is lost in history due to the improper documentation that makes it hard to follow or believe in her existence. Queen Ekwe originates from the Ashanti Empire in Ghana, which was then the Gold Coast. She was born around 1680/90. Exact date unknown. Queen Ekwe, the Queen of Kingston in Jamaica or Cuba Cornwallis, as she is popularly known, is lost in history due to the improper documentation that makes it hard to follow or believe in her existence. She was forcibly transported to the island of Jamaica as a slave by the British. Her enduring legacy and fierce resistance to slavery and colonialism is a source of hope and a shining example to all people that are oppressed and disenfranchised. Queen Ekwe created her own militarized community called an Asafo, and referred to British settlers in Jamaica as the Maroons. Takiyate, also born into the Fan ethnic group, also part of the Akan in the Gold Coast, was a high-ranking chieftain, spoke fluent English, and admitted to selling enemies from other Akan states to be enslaved by the British. At some point, his people lost a war with another Akan state and he was himself sold into slavery under the British. While he was enslaved in Jamaica, Takiyate rose to the position of overseer on his plantation. It was from this position of relative autonomy that he planned his rebellion, with the aid of many other Akan rebels. Takiyate was eventually killed and his head was brought to the British as evidence of his death. Takiyate's role was finished, but several other bands of rebels renewed the effort in wake of Takiyate's death. One was a warrior queen called Ekwe. The British called her Cuba. Queen Ekwe was another Ashanti queen who was elected by the enslaved population in Kingston to lead the subsequent rebellion. Ekwe held court in Kingston, which is on the windward side of the island, the opposite side from where Takiyate had begun the rebellion. Queen Ekwe was outfitted with all of the traditional markers of Akan queenship. Before her campaign even began, they were discovered and she was deported for conspiracy. She foiled her own deportation by bribing the ship captain to transport her to the other side of the island where Takiyate's men were still fighting the British. She fought alongside Takiyate's allies until she was captured and executed 2 months later. Even though it is hard to give exact dates and years for specific events that took place in Queen Ekwe's life, it is safe to say that she found herself in Jamaica in the 1750s and was crowned Queen of Kingston at around 1760, just before the Taki Wars. Runaway communities in the Blue Mountains. However, despite the defeat of Taki, his revolt continued to inspire slaves to resist, either by rebellion or by running away. The revolt did not end there, as other rebellions broke out all over Jamaica, many of which were rightly or wrongly attributed to Taki's cunning and strategy. Other slaves learned of Taki's revolt, which inspired unrest and disorder throughout the island. Rebels numbering about 1,200 regrouped in the unsettled mountainous forests in western Jamaica, under the leadership of the rebel slave christened Wager, but going by his African name of Apongo. They attacked 8 slave plantations in Westmoreland Parish and 2 in Hanover Parish, killing a number of whites. Apongo had been a military leader in West Africa, and he was captured and brought to Jamaica as a slave on a ship named HMS Wager. His owner, Captain Arthur Forrest, Royal Navy officer, renamed Apongo as Wager as a result, and he was enslaved on Forrest's plantation in Westmoreland. Apongo organized the rebellion, which began on April 7, 1760, and went on until October of the following year. Vincent Brown argues that Apongo's rebellion in western Jamaica was more significant than Taki's uprising in St. Mary. According to Thomas Thistlewood, a planter in western Jamaica who kept the priory, Apongo was a prince in Guinea who paid homage to the king of Dahomey. Thistlewood claimed that Apongo was surprised and took prisoner when hunting, and sold for a slave. Vincent Brown argues that Apongo may have been a war chief of Dahomey, or a coastal headman with a troubled relationship with British traders. Refugees, both white and black, fled the Westmoreland capital of Savannah on March, and on May 29, an attempt by the Westmoreland militia to storm the rebels' barricaded encampment was soundly defeated and repelled. On June 2, however, bolstered by militias from 2 more western parishes, a detachment of British soldiers and sailors, and the skilled Maroon warriors of a Kampong town, the colonial forces successfully stormed the barricade and drove the slave rebels out following a 2-hour battle. killing and capturing scores of rebels. The party of Accompong Maroons led by Maroon Captain Kwashi, reporting to White Superintendent John Kelly, captured 6 rebel slaves in one skirmish. On June 10, on the outskirts of the estate of Mesopotamia, owned by Joseph Foster Bottom Guy, a detachment of soldiers and militia defeated a band of rebel slaves, killing about 40 and capturing another 50. The rebel slaves continued fighting for the rest of the year in western Jamaica, forcing the governor, Sir Henry Moore, 1st Baronet, to continue imposing martial law in Westmoreland and surrounding areas. In mid-June, there were uprisings in St. James Parish, Jamaica and Hanover, which were quickly suppressed. On June 28, the militia killed and captured 100 rebel slaves in Westmoreland. On June 22, one of the rebel slaves was given a speedy trial for the murder of 2 white children, and once convicted, was burnt alive. Jack Manson, also known as Three-Fingered Jack Jamaica, was an escaped slave who formed a community of runaways in eastern Jamaica in the 1770s and 1780s. The runaway community thrived in the same parish of St. Thomas in the east, protected by the forested Blue Mountains, from where they often attacked sugar plantations and enabled other slaves to escape. They also attacked white travelers on the roads. It is said that in 1781, Jack was killed by a party of Maroons. However, Jack's runaway community continued to thrive under his deputies. In 1792, Dagger was captured by the Jamaican militia, but Tony then took over as leader of the community of runaway slaves in St. Thomas, and they were never apprehended or dispersed. Second Maroon War main article, Second Maroon War in 1795. The Second Maroon War was instigated when 2 Maroons from Cudjoe's town, Trelawney Town, were flogged by a black slave for allegedly stealing 2 pigs. When 6 Maroon leaders came to the British to present their grievances, the British took them as prisoners. This sparked an 8-month conflict, spurred by the fact that the Trelawney Maroons felt that they were being mistreated under the terms of Cudjoe's Treaty of 1739, which ended the First Maroon War. The war lasted for 5 months and ended in a stalemate, after the colonial militia suffered a number of losses. The British 5,000 troops and militia outnumbered the Maroons and their runaway slave allies 10-1, but the mountainous and forested topography of Jamaica proved ideal for guerrilla warfare. The Trelawney Maroons surrendered in December 1795. Then they felt they were unable to maintain their guerrilla campaign, on the condition that they would not be deported, a promise given to them by Major General George Walpole. During the reign of King George II, the treaty signed in December between Major General George Walpole and the Maroon leaders established that the Maroons of Trelawney Town would beg on their knees for the King's forgiveness, return all runaway slaves, and be relocated elsewhere in Jamaica. The governor of Jamaica ratified the treaty, but gave the Trelawney Maroons only 3 days to present themselves to beg forgiveness on January 1, 1796. Suspicious of British intentions, most of the Trelawney Maroons did not surrender until mid-March. The British used the contrived breach of treaty as a pretext to deport the entire Trelawney Town Maroons to Nova Scotia. After a few years, the Trelawney Maroons were again transported, this time by their request, to the new British settlement of Sierra Leone in West Africa. 19th-century minorities campaigned for rights. In the 18th century, the number of slaves secured their freedom through a variety of means, such as being mistresses or children of plantation whites. In 1780, one of these free people of color, Cuba Cornwallis, became well known when she nursed British naval hero Horatio Nelson, 1st Viscount Nelson, back to health in Port Royal when he took ill. At the turn of the 19th century, the Jamaica Assembly granted Jews voting rights that had previously been denied them. After the abolition of the slave trade in 1878, the Jamaican Assembly felt they needed the support of minority groups in order to avoid the complete emancipation of the slaves. At first, the Assembly resisted attempts from free black people in Jamaica to secure equal rights, and in 1823 the Assembly deported one of their leaders, Louis Celeste Smith. However, after they granted the Jews voting rights, they finally succumbed to demands from the free coloreds for equal rights. Campaigners such as Edward Jordan, Robert Osborne Jamaica and Richard Hill Jamaica were successful in securing equal rights for free people of color at the beginning of the 1830s. Slave resistance. Hundreds of runaway slaves secured their freedom by escaping and fighting alongside the Maroons of Trelawney Town. About half of these runaways surrendered with the Maroons. and many were executed or resold in slavery to Cuba. However, a few hundred stayed out in the forests of the cockpit country, and they joined other runaway communities. In 1798, the slave named Cuffy Jamaica ran away from the western estate, and established a runaway community in St. Mary which was able to resist attempts by the colonial forces and the Maroons remaining in Jamaica to subdue them. In the early 19th century, colonial records describe hundreds of runaway slaves escaping to Hampshire where they flourished for several years before they were captured by a party of Maroons. In 1812, a community of runaways started when a dozen men and some women escaped from the sugar plantations of Trelawney into the cockpit country, and they created a village with the curious name of Me No Send You No Come. By the 1820s, Me No Send You No Come housed between 50 to 60 runaways. The headmen of the community were escaped slaves named Warren and Forbes. Me No Send You No Come also conducted a thriving trade with slaves from the North Coast, who exchanged their salt provisions with the runaways for their ground provisions. In October 1824, the colonial militias tried to destroy this community. However, the community of Me No Send You No Come continued to thrive in the cockpit country until emancipation in the 1830s. The Baptist War main article, Baptist War in 1831, enslaved Baptist preacher Samuel Sharp led a strike among demanding more freedom and a working wage of half the going wage rate. Upon refusal of their demands, the strike escalated into a full rebellion. The Baptist War, as it was known, became the largest slave uprising in the British West Indies, lasting 10 days and mobilized as many as 60,000 of Jamaica's 300,000 slave population. The rebellion was suppressed with relative ease by British forces, under the control of Sir Willoughby Cotton. The reaction of the Jamaican government and plantocracy was far more brutal. Approximately 500 slaves were killed in total, 207 during the revolt, and somewhere in the range between 310 and 340 slaves were killed through various forms of judicial executions after the rebellion was concluded. At times, for quite minor offenses, one recorded execution indicates the crime being the theft of a pig, another, a cow. An 1853 account by Henry Bletby described how 3 or 4 simultaneous executions were commonly observed. Bodies would be allowed to pile up until workhouse Negroes carted the bodies away at night and buried them in mass graves outside town. The brutality of the plantocracy during the revolt is thought to have accelerated the process of emancipation, with initial measures beginning in 1833. Decline of sugar and emancipation. Some historians believe that with the abolition of the slave trade in 1808 and slavery itself in 1834, the island's sugar and slave-based economy faltered. However, Eric Williams has argued that the British only abolished first the slave trade and then slavery itself when they were no longer economically viable institutions. During most of the 18th century, a monocrop economy based on sugar production for export flourished. In the last quarter of the century, however, the Jamaican sugar economy declined as famines, hurricanes, colonial wars, and wars of independence disrupted trade. Despite the British Parliament's 1807 abolition of the slave trade, under which the transportation of slaves to Jamaica after March 1, 1808 was forbidden, sugar continued to have some success over the next decade. By the 1820s, however, Jamaican sugar had become less competitive with that from high-volume producers such as Cuba, and production subsequently declined. When sugar declined as a crop, the British government was persuaded to emancipate the slaves with the abolition of slavery in 1834 and full emancipation within 4 years. Because of the loss of property and life in the 1831 Baptist War Rebellion, the British Parliament held 2 inquiries. Their reports on conditions contributed greatly to the abolition movement and passage of the 1833 law to abolish slavery as of August 1, 1834, throughout the British Empire. The Jamaican slaves were bound indentured to their former owners' service, albeit with a guarantee of rights, until 1838 under what was called the apprenticeship system. This apprenticeship was originally scheduled to run until 1840. But the numerous abuses committed by white plantation owners on their black apprentices led to the British government terminating it 2 years ahead of schedule, and the ex-slaves were finally awarded full freedom. The planters often found themselves in conflict with Richard Hill, the mixed-race head of the Department of the Stipendiary Magistrates, over their mistreatment of the apprentices. Post-Emancipation Jamaica. The period after emancipation in the 1830s initially was marked by a conflict between the plantocracy and elements in the colonial office over the extent to which individual freedom should be coupled with political participation for blacks. In 1840 the Assembly changed the voting qualifications in a way that enabled a significant number of blacks and people of mixed race browns or mulattoes to vote, but placed property ownership restrictions on them, which excluded the majority of non-white men from voting. The requirements were an income of £180 a year, or real property worth £1,800, for both real and personal property worth £3,000. These figures excluded the vast majority of freed black Jamaicans from the right to vote in assembly elections. Consequently, neither emancipation nor the change in voting qualifications resulted in a change in the political system. The chief interests of the planter class lay in the continued profitability of their estates, and they continued to dominate the elitist assembly. At the end of the 18th century and in the early years of the 19th century, the Crown began to allow some Jamaicans, mostly local merchants, urban professionals, and artisans, into the appointed councils. Two free people of color, Edward Jordan and Richard Hill, became leading figures in post-emancipation Jamaica. In 1835, Hill was appointed head of the Department of Stipendiary Magistrates, a position he held for many years. In 1835, Jordan was elected a member of the Assembly for Kingston, and he led the King's House Party, or Coloured Party, that opposed the Planters' Party. In 1852, Jordan became Mayor Kingston, a post he held for 14 years, and he was Speaker for the Assembly in the early 1860s. 20th century Marcus Garvey. Main article, Marcus Garvey Marcus Mota Garvey, the black activist and trade unionist, founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League in 1914, one of Jamaica's first political parties in 1929, and the Workers' Association in the early 1930s. Garvey also promoted the Back to Africa movement, which called for those of African descent to return to the homelands of their ancestors. Garvey, to no avail, pleaded with the colonial government to improve living conditions for black and indigenous peoples in the West Indies. Garvey, a controversial figure, had been the target of a 4-year investigation by the United States government. He was convicted of mail fraud in 1923 and has served most of a 5-year term in an Atlanta penitentiary when he was deported to Jamaica in 1927. Garvey left the colony in 1935 to live in the United Kingdom, where he died heavily in debt 5 years later. He was proclaimed Jamaica's first national hero in the 1960s after Edward P. Giesecke, then a government minister, arranged the return of his remains to Jamaica. In 1987 Jamaica petitioned the United States Congress to pardon Garvey on the basis that the federal charges brought against him were unsubstantiated and unjust. Rastafari movement. Main article, Rastafari. The Rastafari movement, an Abrahamic religion, was developed in Jamaica in the 1930s, following the coronation of Haile Selassie I, Emperor of Ethiopia. Haile Selassie I was crowned as Emperor of Ethiopia in November 1930, a significant event in that Ethiopia was the only African country other than Liberia to be independent from colonialism, and Haile Selassie was the only African leader accepted among the kings and queens of Europe. Over the next 2 years, 3 Jamaicans who all happened to be overseas at the time of the coronation each returned home and independently began, as street preachers, to proclaim the divinity of the newly crowned emperor as the returned Christ. First, in December 1930, Archibald Donkly, formerly a seaman, landed at Port Antonio and soon began his ministry. In 1933, he relocated to Kingston where the King of Kings Ethiopian Mission was founded. Joseph Hibbert returned from Costa Rica in 1931 and started spreading his own conviction of the emperor's divinity in Mano District, St. Andrew Parish. Through his own ministry, called Ethiopian Coptic Faith, he too moved to Kingston the next year, to find Leonard Howell already teaching many of these same doctrines, having returned to Jamaica around the same time. With the addition of Robert Hines, himself a Garveyite and former Bedwardite, these 4 preachers soon began to attract a following among Jamaica's poor. The Great Depression and worker protests elected black council members, such as Barrister J.A.G. Smith, strongly criticized the colonial government in the early 20th century. While acknowledging these criticisms, the British government did little to address them. The Great Depression caused sugar prices to slump in 1929 and led to the return of many Jamaicans, who had migrated abroad for work. Economic stagnation, discontent with unemployment, low wages, high prices, and poor living conditions caused social unrest in the 1930s. Uprisings in Jamaica began on a Prome sugar estate in the western parish of Westmoreland and quickly spread east to Kingston. Jamaica, in particular, set the pace for the region in its demands for economic development from British colonial rule. The police put down the strike with force, resulting in the deaths of several strikers, while a number of policemen were injured. This led to further disturbances occurring in other parts of the island. In 1938, the Post-Emancipation Industrial Trade Union gathered support, while Norman Manley formed the People's National Party, which initially also included his cousin, Union leader Alexander Post-Emancipation. Because of disturbances in Jamaica and the rest of the region, the British in 1938 appointed the Moines Commission. An immediate result of the commission was a Colonial Development Welfare Act, which provided for the expenditure of approximately £1 million a year for 20 years on coordinated development in the British West Indies. Concrete actions, however, were not implemented to deal with Jamaica's massive structural problems. New labor unions and political parties. The rise of nationalism, as distinct from island identification or desire for self-determination, is generally dated to the 1938 labor riots that took place in Jamaica and the islands of the Eastern Caribbean. William Alexander Post-Emancipation, a moneylender or loan shark in the capital city of Kingston who had formed the Jamaica Trade Workers and Tradesmen Union JTWTU 3 years earlier, captured the imagination of the black masses with his messianic personality. He was light-skinned, affluent, and aristocratic. Post-Emancipation emerged from the 1938 strikes and other disturbances as a populist leader and the principal spokesperson for the militant urban working class. In that year, using the JWTU as a stepping stone, he founded the Post-Emancipation Industrial Trade Union (BITU), which inaugurated Jamaica's workers' movement. A cousin of Post-Emancipation, Norman W. Manley, concluded as a result of the 1938 riots that the basis for national unity in Jamaica lay in the masses. Unlike the union-oriented Post-Emancipation, however, Manley was more interested in access to control over state power and political rights for the masses. On September 18, 1938, he inaugurated the People's National Party (PNP). It began as a nationalist movement supported by a mixed-race middle class and the liberal sector of the business community. Its leaders were highly educated members of the upper middle class. The 1938 riots spurred the PNP to unionize labor, although it would be several years before the PNP formed major labor unions. The party concentrated its earliest efforts on establishing the network both in urban areas and in banana-growing rural parishes, later working on building support among small farmers and in areas of bauxite mining. In 1940 the PNP adopted a socialist ideology and later it joined the Socialist International, aligning formally with the social democratic parties of Western Europe. Guided by socialist principles, Manley was not a doctrinaire socialist. PNP socialism during the 1940s was similar to British Labour Party ideas on state control of the factors of production, equality of opportunity, and a welfare state. The left-wing element in the PNP held more orthodox Marxist views and worked for the internationalization of the trade union movement through the Caribbean Labour Congress. In those formative years of Jamaican political and union activity, relations between Manley and Post-Emancipation were cordial. Manley defended Post-Emancipation in court against charges brought by the British for his labor activism in the 1938 riots and looked after the BITU during Post-Emancipation's imprisonment, which would later prove to be his and the PNP's downfall. Post-Emancipation had political ambitions of his own, however. In 1942, while still incarcerated, he founded a political party to rival the PNP, called the Jamaica Labour Party (JLP). The new party, whose leaders were of a lower class than those of the PNP, was supported by conservative businessmen and 60,000 dues-paying BITU members. They encompassed dock and sugar plantation workers and other unskilled urban laborers. On his release in 1943, Post-Emancipation began building up the JLP. Meanwhile, several PNP leaders organized the leftist-oriented trade union Congress TUC. Thus, from an early stage in modern Jamaica, unionist labor was an integral part of organized political life. For the next quarter-century, Bustamante and Manley competed for center stage in Jamaican political affairs, the former espousing the cause of the barefoot man, the latter, democratic socialism, the loosely defined political and economic theory aimed at achieving the classless system of government. Jamaica's two founding fathers projected quite different popular images. Bustamante, lacking even a high school diploma, thus his election motto "You don't need education," was an autocratic, charismatic, and highly adept politician. Manley was an athletic, Oxford-trained lawyer, Rhodes Scholar, humanist, and liberal intellectual. Although considerably more reserved than Bustamante, Manley was well-liked and widely respected. He was also a visionary nationalist who became the driving force behind the Crown Colony's quest for independence. Following the 1938 disturbances in the West Indies, London sent the Moines Commission to study conditions in the British Caribbean territories. Its findings led in the early 1940s to better wages and a new constitution. In 1954, the PNP expelled Richard Hart, Jamaican politician, a Marxist, and 3 other PNP members for their alleged communist views, a ploy used again in the late 1970s by Edward Seaga. The other 3 members were Frank Hill, Ken Hill and Arthur Henry, and they were collectively referred to as the 4HS. Hart and the other members of the 4HS were very active in the trade union movement in Jamaica. In the 1940s and 1950s, Hart worked as a member of the Executive Committee of the Trade Union Council from 1946 to 1948. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Caribbean Labour Congress from 1945 to 1946 and Assistant Secretary from 1947 to 1953. The expulsion of the 4HS signaled a parting of ways between the PNP and the Trade Union Congress TUC, which was aligned to the PNP. The National Workers' Union NWU effectively filled the vacuum left by the TUC. Colonial elections. The new constitution increased voter eligibility considerably. In 1919, women gained the right to vote in Jamaica, but only about 1/12 of the population had the right to vote. In 1943, out of a population of 1.2 million, about 700,000 now had the right to vote. Issued on November 28, 1944, the Constitution modified the Crown Colony system and inaugurated limited self-government based on the Westminster model of government and universal adult suffrage. It also embodied the island's principles of ministerial responsibility and the rule of law. 31% of the population participated in the 1944 elections. Held on December 12, 1944, the turnout was 58.7%. The Jamaica Labour Party, helped by its promises to create jobs, its practice of dispensing public funds in pro-JLP parishes, and the PNP's relatively radical platform, won an 18% majority of the votes over the PNP, as well as 22 seats in the 30-member House of Representatives. The PNP won 5 seats and 5 were gained by other, short-lived parties. Bustamante took office as the unofficial leader of government. Under the new charter, the British governor, assisted by the 6-member Privy Council and 10-member Executive Council, remained responsible solely to the Crown. The Jamaican Legislative Council became the upper house, or Senate, of the bicameral parliament. House members were elected by adult suffrage from single-member electoral districts called constituencies. Despite these changes, ultimate power remained concentrated in the hands of the governor and other high officials. The 1949 Jamaican general election was much closer. The PNP received more votes, 203,048, than the JLP, 199,538, but the JLP secured more seats, 17 to the PNP's 13. 2 seats were won by independents. The voter turnout was 65.2%. The party lobbied the colonial government for a further increase in constitutional powers for the elected government, and in June 1953 a new constitution provided for the appointment of a chief minister and 7 other ministers from the elected House of Representatives. They now had a majority over the official and nominated members. For the first time, the ministers could now exercise wide responsibility in the management of the internal affairs of the island. The only limits placed on their powers pertained to public security, public prosecutions and matters affecting members of the civil service, which still fell under the colonial secretary. In 1953, Bustamante became Jamaica's first chief minister, the pre-independence title for head of government. In the 1955 Jamaican general election, with things being more open to the public, The PNP won for the first time, securing 18 out of 32 seats. The JLP ended up with 14 seats, and there were no independents. The voter turnout was 65.1%. As a result, Norman Manley became the new chief minister. The 1959 Jamaica general election was held on July 28, 1959, and the number of seats was increased to 45. The PNP secured a wider margin of victory, taking 29 seats to the JLP's 16. Manley was appointed Jamaica's first premier on August 14, 1959. West Indies Federation and Independence of Jamaica. When the British government decided to merge its Caribbean colonies, the West Indies Federation, consisting of Jamaica and 9 other colonies, was formed in 1958. The West Indies Federal Labour Party was organised by Manley and the Democratic Labour Party by Bustamante. In the 1958 federal elections, the DLP won 11 of the 17 seats in Jamaica. Neither Manley nor Bustamante contested the federal elections. However, nationalism was at a rise and dissatisfaction with the new union was great. Jamaica's share of seats in the federal parliament was smaller than its share of the total population of the federation. Many Jamaicans expressed the view that the smaller islands would be a drain on Jamaica's wealth. Jamaica was geographically distant from the Eastern Caribbean, and many Jamaicans were upset that Kingston was not chosen as the federal capital. 3 years after the federal elections, the Federation was no closer to secured independence, and Bustamante began campaigning for Jamaica's withdrawal from the Federation, in order for Jamaica to secure its independence in its own right. Manley responded by offering the people a chance to decide whether or not they wanted Jamaica to remain in the Federation. In the 1961 Federation membership referendum, Jamaica voted 54% to leave the West Indies Federation. Other members began withdrawing soon after. After losing the referendum, Manley took Jamaica to the polls in April 1962, to secure a mandate for the island's independence. On April 10, 1962, of the 45 seats up for contention in the 1962 Jamaica general election, the JLP won 26 seats and the PNP 19. The voter turnout was 72.9%. This resulted in the independence of Jamaica on August 6, 1962, and several other British colonies in the West Indies followed suit in the next decade. Bustamante had replaced Manley as premier between April and August, and on independence, he became Jamaica's first prime minister. Economy. The first European settlers, the Spanish, were primarily interested in extracting precious metals and did not develop or otherwise transform Jamaica. In 1655 the English occupied the island and began the slow process of creating an agricultural economy based on slave labor in support of England's Industrial Revolution. During the 17th century, the basic patterns and social system of the sugar plantation economy were established in Jamaica. Large estates owned by absentee planters were managed by local agents. The slave population increased rapidly during the last quarter of the 17th century and, by the end of the century, slaves outnumbered white Europeans by at least 5 to 1. Because conditions were extremely harsh under the slave regime and the mortality rate for slaves was high, the slave population expanded through the slave trade from West Africa rather than by natural increase. During most of the 18th century, a monocrop economy based on sugar production for export flourished. In the last quarter of the century, however, the Jamaican sugar economy declined as famines, hurricanes, colonial wars, and wars of independence disrupted trade. By the 1820s, Jamaican sugar had become less competitive with that from high-volume producers such as Cuba, and production subsequently declined. By 1882 sugar output was less than half the level achieved in 1828. Some historians believe that a major reason for the decline of sugar was the British Parliament's 1807 abolition of the slave trade, under which the transportation of slaves to Jamaica after March 1, 1808 was forbidden. However, C. Maud Drescher has argued that the Jamaican sugar economy flourished before and after the abolition of the slave trade. The abolition of the slave trade was followed by the abolition of slavery in 1834 and full emancipation within 4 years. Herc Williams presented evidence to show that the sugar economy went into decline in the 1820s, and it was only then that the British anti-slavery movement gathered pace. Unable to convert the ex-slaves into a sharecropping tenant class similar to the one established in the post-Civil War South of the United States, planters became increasingly dependent on wage labor and began recruiting workers abroad. primarily from India, China, and Sierra Leone. Many of the former slaves settled in peasant or small farm communities in the interior of the island, the Yam Belt, where they engaged in subsistence and some cash crop farming. The second half of the 19th century was a period of severe economic decline for Jamaica. Low crop prices, droughts, and disease led to serious social unrest, culminating in the Moran Day rebellions of 1865. However, renewed British administration after the 1865 rebellion, in the form of Crown colony status, resulted in some social and economic progress as well as investment in the physical infrastructure. Agricultural development was a centerpiece of restored British rule in Jamaica. In 1868 the first large-scale irrigation project was launched. In 1895 the Jamaica Agricultural Society was funded to promote more scientific and profitable methods of farming. Also in the 1890s, the Crown Lands Settlement Scheme was introduced, a land reform program of sorts, which allowed small farmers to purchase 2 hectares or more of land on favorable terms. Between 1865 and 1930, the character of landholding in Jamaica changed substantially, as sugar declined in importance. As many former plantations went bankrupt, some land was sold to Jamaican peasants under the Crown Lands Settlement, whereas other cane fields were consolidated by dominant British producers, most notably by the British firm Tate and Lyle. Although the concentration of land and wealth in Jamaica was not as drastic as in the Spanish-speaking Caribbean, by the 1920s the typical sugar plantation on the island had increased to an average of 266 hectares. But, as noted, small-scale agriculture in Jamaica survived the consolidation of land by sugar powers. The number of small holdings in fact trickled between 1865 and 1930, thus retaining a large portion of the population as peasantry. Most of the expansion in small holdings took place before 1910, with farms averaging between 2 and 20 hectares. The rise of the banana trade during the second half of the 19th century also changed production and trade patterns on the island. Bananas were first exported in 1867, and banana farming grew rapidly thereafter. By 1890, bananas had replaced sugar as Jamaica's principal export. Production rose from 5 million stems, 32% of exports in 1897, to an average of 20 million stems a year in the 1920s and 1930s, or over half of domestic exports. As with sugar, the presence of American companies, like the well-known United Fruit Company in Jamaica, was a driving force behind renewed agricultural exports. The British also became more interested in Jamaican bananas than in the country's sugar. The expansion of banana production, however, was hampered by serious labor shortages. The rise of the banana economy took place amidst a general exodus of up to 11,000 Jamaicans a year. The Great Depression caused sugar prices to slump in 1929 and led to the return of many Jamaicans. Economic stagnation, discontent with unemployment, low wages, high prices, and poor living conditions caused social unrest in the 1930s. Uprisings in Jamaica began on the Frome Sugar Estate in the western parish of Westmoreland and quickly spread east to Kingston. Jamaica, in particular, set the pace for the region in its demands for economic development from British colonial rule. Because of disturbances in Jamaica and the rest of the region, the British in 1938 appointed the Moines Commission. An immediate result of the commission was a Colonial Development Welfare Act, which provided for the expenditure of approximately £1 million a year for 20 years on coordinated development in the British West Indies. Concrete actions, however, were not implemented to deal with Jamaica's massive structural problems. The expanding relationship that Jamaica entered into with the United States during World War I produced a momentum for change that could not be turned back by the end of the war. Familiarity with the early economic progress achieved in Puerto Rico under Operation Bootstrap, renewed immigration to the United States, the lasting impressions of Marcus Garvey, and the publication of the Moines Commission report led to important modifications in the Jamaican political process and demands for economic development. As was the case throughout the Commonwealth Caribbean in the mid to late 1930s, social upheaval in Jamaica paved the way for the emergence of strong trade unions and nascent political parties. These changes set the stage for early modernization in the 1940s and 1950s and for limited self-rule, introduced in 1944. An extensive period of post-war growth transformed Jamaica into an increasingly industrial society. This pattern was accelerated with the export of bauxite beginning in the 1950s. The economic structure shifted from a dependence on agriculture that in 1950 accounted for 30.8% of GDP to an agricultural contribution of 12.9% in 1960 and 6.7% in 1970. During the same period, the contribution to GDP of mining increased from less than 1% in 1950 to 9.3% in 1960 and 12.6% in 1970. Manufacturing expanded from 11.3% in 1950 to 12.8% in 1960 and 15.7% in 1997. Through the years, one thing has always remained constant, even though most times suppressed, is the right for people to oppose their government if they are deemed not to be in the interest of the citizens.